The Roaring Twenties, the Good Times, the Jazz Age, the Dry Decade, the Age of Intolerance, the Age of Wonderful Nonsense. This vast range of names actually embody the decade which historians and critics have enthusiastically regarded as the birth, the beginning, and the rise of modern America, the 1920s. A decade of transition between two periods of unquestionable national darkness. The First World War between 1914 and 1918, and the Wall Street crash of 1929, the turning point towards the Great Depression of the 1930s. As a consequence of war, both Germany and Great Britain had lost their power, and thus allowed the United States to acquire the position of world dominance never held before. The starting point of this roaring era came with the elections of 1920, in which the main political parties had to confront a post-war situation of national fear and depression. The Republican candidate Warren G. Harding bet the Democrat James M. Cox with more than 16 million votes, in contrast to the 9 million Americans that supported the Democrats. However, only 49% of the electoral roll actually voted. In the light of the national situation, Harding had promised during his campaign the return to normalcy and to a concern for national issues. This policy of normalcy by Harding favored economic prosperity and technological development, following a line exclusively oriented towards business. The Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover, encouraged the association between government and private companies, giving rise to the so-called political project of associative democracy. In fact, the gross national product of the nation rose from $74 billion at the beginning of the decade to more than $104 billion in 1929. In consequence, wages were much higher, so Americans had much more money to spend. The greatest economic boom took place in the area of consumer and domestic goods, such as cars, and home appliances such as radios, cookers, and telephones. Even more, ordinary citizens were encouraged by means of advertising to buy these goods, acquisitions which were now affordable after the times of war. Therefore, leaving aside other darker issues such as agricultural depression and rural poverty, which persisted during the whole decade, the 1920s witnessed a prodigious industrial prosperity, led in the first place by the automobile industry and three dominant companies, Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler. In fact, while in 1917 less than a sixth part of American families owned an automobile, in 1920 the total number summed more than 8 million, and in 1929 almost 25 million. So, 1 out of 5 Americans was the owner of a vehicle. Hence, the automobile rose as the symbol of the social status of families, as well as encouraging the development of several other industrial fields and materials, such as steel, lead, and textiles, and most particularly the boost of the building industry and consequently urbanization and the displacement of the American population all over the territory. The expansion of radio and consequently the emergence of broadcasting boosted popular music, especially jazz, blues, and ragtime, the most representative musical genres of the decade. Equally characteristic of the 20s is the so-called Charleston, a popular dance considered certainly immoral at the time. However roaring and prosperous they may be considered, the 1920s actually provided the other side of the coin too. Parallel to industrial success, the Ku Klux Klan expanded very rapidly during the 1920s, after extinguishing in 1870 and having reappeared back in 1915. In fact, in 1924, the racist organization had almost reached a number of 5 million members. Moreover, the 1920s were also known as the Dry Decade, due to the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution, according to which the manufacture, sale, import and export of alcohol was prohibited all over the American territory. This enactment, which was not partially abolished until 1933, came to be known as the Prohibition, but social acceptance was not at all complete. The alcohol banning gave rise to the so-called speakeasies, or illegal private clubs where drinking was possible, and to a whole wave of corruption, smuggling, and gangsters, of which the best-known representative is Al Capone, known as Scarface. Amongst these groups of repression, the 1920s were also remarkable for helping women in their fight for political equality. The 19th Amendment to the Constitution brought the establishment of the right for women to vote, which allowed them to acquire much more independence than previously imagined. Meanwhile, political controversies, economic prosperity, and social change vastly contributed to the cultural life of the decade. The 1920s witnessed the rapid expansion of motion picture production, the settlement of Hollywood as the one and only capital of the industry, the beginning of the Oscars, which were first awarded in 1929, and the emergence of the so-called star system, with performers such as Gloria Swanson, Joan Crawford, Rudolph Valentino, Buster Keaton, Harold Lloyd, and most remarkably Charlie Chaplin. Moreover, for most of the decade, the films produced were silent, but in 1927, The Jazz Singer, starring Al Jolson, was the first motion picture with synchronized dialogue sequences, establishing the beginning of the so-called talkie, which contributed enormously to set Hollywood as the world's leading movie industry. However, quite oppositely, in the field of literature, authors like F. Scott Fitzgerald, William Faulkner, Ernest Hemingway, or Sinclair Lewis portrayed a darker view of the American 20s and the failure of the American dream. By and large, the times were not as good or as happy as the whole nation pretended. In fact, as a combination of prosperity, wealth, poverty, and disillusionment, few decades have evoked feelings and thoughts as powerful and as different as the 1920s. However it may be, there is no doubt that this decade paved the road and set the tone for America to be what it has been since the 20s roared at the whole world.